Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for being here with us today at this MED Dialogue, which is part of a series of initiatives and events that ISPI, in cooperation with the Italian Foreign Ministry, is hosting in preparation to the big gathering of the 8th edition of the Rome Med Mediterranean Dialogues Conference that this year will be held from the 1st to the 3rd of December, so save the date. My name is Chiara Lovotti. I'm a research fellow at ISPI, and today I'm honored to introduce Rina Amiri, the US Special Envoy for Afghan women, girls, and human rights. Ms. Amiri, welcome. And I know that you have a very busy agenda. So on behalf of ISPI and the Foreign Ministry, I wish to thank you so much for finding the time to be with us. For those who may not know her, Ms. Amiri has taken up this role in the US Department of State in January this year, if I'm not wrong. But she was a senior advisor to the US Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan under the Obama administration already. She has 2 decades of political expertise, advising and working with governments in various conflict areas of the Middle East and Central Asia and Europe as well, with a focus on inclusion in mediation processes. This is a very important topic. She also served for the United Nations in several capacities and has held senior and leadership positions in a variety of university and think tanks. So, Ms. Amiri, thank you again for being with us. And let me go straight to the first point that we would like to discuss with you today, which is, of course, the women's situation in Afghanistan. We all know that with the Taliban's takeover of Kabul last year, August 2021, the fundamental rights and freedoms of women and girls across Afghanistan have worsened dramatically. Let me give just a few data collected by Amnesty International. Prior to the Taliban taking power, millions of young girls were enrolled in schools. Approximately 88,000 female students were studying at public and private universities, so high university level, and women accounted for 36% of workers in the media sectors and for 28% of parliamentarians and government officials of Afghanistan's provinces. The last one is quite a good, remarkable percentage, actually, if you think about it, even compared to other countries in the region or even to the countries, let's say. But now women and young girls have almost completely disappeared from public life. And this conversation with you, Ms. Amiri, is particularly timely, as we have heard the latest news from the Taliban government the other day that now women are even prohibited from getting out of their houses unless they wear a burqa, the head-to-toe clothing kind of thing. So what is your understanding of the current situation on the ground in Afghanistan from, of course, the humanitarian and human rights perspective point of view? What is your evaluation?
First, thank you very much for having me as a part of this discussion and for putting the spotlight on the situation of Afghan women and girls. It's a very serious situation, and you've laid out the data, you've laid out the statistics, and I think that tells the real story. Afghan women and the gains that they had made was the greatest success of the last 2 decades. Afghan women were being increasingly integrated into the economy, and the success of Afghan women spoke to the success of putting a foundation in place for the success of Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the de facto Taliban authorities have failed to grasp the extent to which they are damaging Afghanistan as a whole when they strip Afghan women of their rights. What we've been seeing has been a contradiction of all of the commitments that the Taliban have been making, not just for the last 8 months, but for the last 2 years in the negotiation process, where they repeatedly underscored that they were not the Taliban of the past. They were not the Taliban of the 1990s, but they are a Taliban that recognized the new Afghanistan and the necessity of meaningful including women and at all levels and the way that they had been. And what we've seen since August is a consistent stripping of Afghan women of their rights, of their educational rights, of their right to work, of their right to mobility. And in fact, what a lot of Afghan women are saying is, well, the Taliban are saying that they've brought the war to an end. They have initiated and are continuing to manifest a war against Afghan women.
Yeah, absolutely, you're right. And you mentioned how this basically casts a shadow on the future of these individuals, and especially women. And you know, education defines the future. So let me stick to the education domain, which you mentioned. You took part in the Oslo humanitarian talk last January, if I'm not wrong. And you were reassured by the Taliban that they will, in fact, eventually deliver on education, because they said it is a principle of Islam for women to be educated. But what happened after that? Because we know in late March, on the contrary, the Taliban government has banned secondary education for girls. So why do the Taliban change their minds on female education? What happened? Can you help us understand?
I think this is a key question we're all asking, and we're putting that question to the Taliban. We take stock of the fact that in the 1990s, the Taliban also made commitments and reneged on their commitments and came up with the same type of arguments and rationalizations that they said that in the past, they also did not say that women should not have an education, but they kept on putting forward what appeared as excuses, that it was about logistics, it was about security. And once again, we are seeing the same trend. And I think it's something that strips the Taliban of credibility. If they continue going in this direction, the good faith that the Afghan people have put in the Taliban that this time that they're going to be doing things differently, and by the international community that the Taliban could potentially become a more credible interlocutor, that is receding very rapidly. The Taliban did very clearly and emphatically say that girls were going to go to school, and we have heard one excuse after another from the Taliban, that it started out with logistics and travel, then it became about attire, and they sometimes bring forth the issue of culture. But when we go back throughout Afghan history, not just in the last 20 years, but throughout Afghan history, that the Afghan population have fully embraced the education of women, the ability and the right of women to work, and the right of women to become citizens of the country. This is not the culture that the Taliban are espousing, is Taliban culture. It is not Afghan culture.
Absolutely. And do you think that education is a topic that divides the Taliban leadership as well, or it's kind of a monolith in this sense?
You know, I can say that the conversations that I've had with the Taliban and with the Taliban that I have had the opportunity to discuss these issues in concrete details, they have expressed strong support for education. Some have even, we're hearing reports of frustration among some of the Taliban leaders that this has not gone forward, that they in fact feel that they have lost face by not being able to deliver on this issue. And the assessment is that there are some elements of the Taliban who've imposed a very hard line on these issues. But for us, what is important is not whether there are some Taliban who are supportive and other Taliban who are not supportive. It's ultimately what the Taliban can deliver. They may have, their divisions, their internal differences, but that is less relevant to us than the Taliban. And when I say us, I'm talking about the Afghan population that we are expressing our strong support for and are working in support of, as well as the broader international community, including the U.S., European allies, Muslim majority countries. What we need to see is concrete actions. We are not going to sit and play a guessing game in terms of where the Taliban stands on this issue and where they are on that spectrum. We are asking for a concrete delivery on this commitment for the Afghan women and for the Afghan people.
Absolutely. What is needed is the delivery of these important services for the population. And the population of Afghanistan is, of course, is not passive. And we have witnessed over these weeks and months how these restrictions from the Taliban, which, by the way, do not include are not just about education, but they do include also work and participation in political life. We have seen how these have triggered protests across all cities of Afghanistan. And in my perspective as well, that at least that requires, I suppose, a lot of courage for those people, for women especially, to get in the street and mobilize and protest against this government. What is, in your opinion, that these protests tell us? I mean, what is the extent of popular support that the Taliban government really enjoys at the end of the day?
Well, again, what the Taliban failed to realize is that education is not a luxury issue. The right of women to work is not a luxury issue for Afghans. Afghanistan is a very, it's economically and struggling enormously. It's a country that has enormous needs that are challenged right now. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. And there's a recognition among the population that to get food on the table, their daughters have to be educated, they have to be educated and allowed to work, that their wives have to be allowed to work. All of that is about having some level of economic viability in a future for their families and for the country. They see that very clearly, that this is not a religious issue. This is not a cultural issue. This is about the economic viability of the country and the future of the country, and having any type of hope for the 40 million people in Afghanistan that are struggling immensely right now. And they are showing immense courage because they must. There is no other option right now. Afghan people feel like they have nothing to lose. Afghan women feel that they're virtual prisoners in their homes. And right now, they say that in many ways, what they're experiencing is worse than anything that they have endured through their lifetimes, or for some that went through the Taliban, when the Taliban were last ruling Afghanistan, that this is a return of a nightmare and one that's stripping their daughters of a future. So this is something that both Afghan women and men feel very strongly about. It's going to lead to further migration, and I fear instability inside the country unless the Taliban change course.
Yeah, sure. Ms. Amiri, recent international efforts and local efforts as well have focused on trying to defend education for women. Whereas the right to work, the right, as I was saying, to take part in political life, those have been maybe our understanding, but those have been a bit neglected perhaps, but they're equally important. And some Afghani activists were worried that if the Taliban were to reopen schools, they may use, let's say, this gesture as a, well, blackmail is not the right word, but as a way to say, okay, now we please you on the education dossier, don't ask us more. Do you see this coming? And how can both these priorities, education and work, because both speak to future, right? How can they be both assessed at the same time in the same way?
I fully agree, and I think the messaging from us has been very consistent that education cannot be separated from work. Education is, as I noted, it's not a luxury issue. It's a means of being able to work. It's a means of being able to get an income. All of these issues are linked. Education, mobility, work, participation in public life. And one cannot be separated out from all of the others, because we are speaking about enabling 50% of the population to participate in the life of the country towards the future of the country. And I think that if you look at certainly messages from my office as well as throughout the US government, you'll see that that messaging has been very consistent. And also now with this last edict on dress, what we have highlighted is that we need progress on all of these fronts. And this is an issue that this is a message that has been certainly echoed and reinforced by our allies in Europe, as well as in Muslim majority countries in the last several months.
Yeah, and speaking of the US and European allies, let me come to the role of the international community in this tragedy, let's say. What kind of lever can we have and can we use to pressure the Taliban to respect women and girls' rights?
Honestly, what I would like the Taliban to see as the main source of leverage is engendering the confidence of the Afghan population. That should be the greatest source of leverage on this issue, because what the Taliban tell me in direct conversations is they want an economically viable Afghanistan. They want an Afghanistan that is not donor dependent. They want an Afghanistan where the conflict is fully brought to an end. And they want to take credit for getting Afghanistan to that place. In order to get there, they have to enable Afghan women and girls and the population as a whole to have their rights, the right to education, the right to work, to participation in all aspects of life, inclusive governance. All of these are going to be really critical factors to prevent a further brain drain, to prevent further instability, and to enable economic viability. So that's the first point that I would say. And in terms of what the international community has to offer, I would say that certainly diplomatic engagement there is a really key issue that we are looking at. We are testing the proposition with the Taliban, and we continue to do so, of whether they're actually going to be able to deliver. And as more time goes and the Taliban, instead of opening space, closes space, we are recalibrating whether that is a proposition that can still hold. And there are a number of other factors on the table. The Taliban want greater economic engagement inside Afghanistan. They want to be seen as a credible and respected actor in the international community. And what we've said to them is that they need to essentially enact the policies of what would be a respectable actor in the international scene to have that type of relationship with the international community and to get more support and more aid. But at this point, what we're seeing is an indication that the Taliban are not prepared to do what is required in order to move forward on that path.
Yeah, and sticking to this point of credibility of international actors, and I don't mean to sound provocative, of course, I just want to try to understand. Do you think that we may have lost credibility a bit? And by we, I mean the US, NATO countries, mainly Europe as well. But, after the withdrawal from the country, although there was not a complete one, but it was a significant reduction of forces, right? Speaking realistically, what remaining leverage do we have at this point to pressure the government of Kabul?
I think we need to be realistic and just look at the concrete facts on the ground. The US and most of the European allies no longer have a presence on the ground. There is not a military force. So certainly all of that we factor in as a reality. So the relationship is very different, the engagement is very different, and yes, the leverage is very different. But I think what we need to do is expand our scope and expand our vision. One of the areas in which I'm really focusing on is outreach to Muslim majority countries who are in a position to really engage the Taliban in a very credible way on the issue of women's rights, in particular, because the Taliban bring in the issue of Sharia. Now, we see Muslim countries throughout the world in which women are actively engaged in education at all levels, at work, and they do not, they do not believe that what the Taliban are practicing aligns with what Islam prescribes for women. I can tell you, as a Muslim woman, I certainly don't see it, and I think it'll be really important for the Muslim world to be a leading voice in pushing back against the Taliban and engaging the Taliban and expanding their lens and making them recognize that what they are doing is destructive for Afghan women, destructive for Afghanistan, and destructive for the image of Islam. So that's, I think, an area that we will continue to work on. One of my efforts has been really engaging OIC countries. And moreover, I think what we need to be doing is lifting the voices of Afghans themselves to engage the Taliban, both the Afghans who have been recently forced to flee Afghanistan, who represent a wide range of incredibly important voices that need to be integrated in our discussions with the Taliban, as well as the voices inside Afghanistan. They should be at the forefront and supported, and making the demands from the Taliban, and that we stand behind them.
A curiosity on this point, do you think that among these Muslim majority countries, there will be one specifically that will be better positioned than others to act as a mediator or to try to talk to Kabul or not? And maybe you mentioned the OIC may take up this role?
I think there are a range of really significant and important actors that can play an important role in Afghanistan. Certainly, the OIC has been playing a very constructive and important role. There's a host of countries. Qatar, UAE, Pakistan can play a very important role, given that it is a neighboring country and it has had a long history with the Taliban and a very unique relationship with the Taliban. But what I advocate, and the case that I'm making, is that the international community as a whole needs to be coherent, coordinated, and speaking in one voice for the Taliban. That is where we have the maximum leverage. And our voices need to reflect the needs inside the country and amplify the voices of those inside the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming with to the negotiations with the Taliban, Ms. Amiri, as anticipated, you attended the Oslo talks on the humanitarian crisis in the country. What are some of the lessons learned that you got from the meeting?
What I would say is that the Taliban shouldn't be underestimated. They're actors that have, and that has happened in the past. And I think underestimating them is to our own folly, because of their policies that are, in many respects, contrary to what we would expect of a sophisticated state actors that want to serve as state actors. Sometimes we can underestimate them, and I would say we shouldn't underestimate them, and in terms of also their own strategy that they're trying to undertake. And second, that we should also always test our assumptions. The assumption of that there's a Taliban 2.0, that has been something that was put out often. And I think that stepping back and looking very concretely in terms of what the Taliban are saying versus what they're actually prepared to deliver on is very important in terms of how you assess the Taliban. Third, the Taliban, I have, my background is in mediation and conflict resolution. And what I would say of the Taliban is, I would say of any actor in which you engage and you mediate with, you listen, you identify their strategic interests, and you engage them on the basis of their strategic interests, not on the basis of a narrative that's being put out there, but on the basis of a very concrete issues on which you engage in specificity to try to get to a point where it's very clear on both ends in terms of what is expected. And I think that's something that we are doing. There has been no ambiguity on our end in terms of what we expect from the Taliban to deliver for the Afghan people in terms of women's rights and human rights. That is a negotiation in which we've been undertaking our discussion that we've been having with the Taliban very consistently and very concrete details. And that's going to be the approach that we're going to consistently take with them.
Yeah, and speaking of negotiations, and in particular, as this is a subject that you've worked in depth in your career, what can the international community and the US do to ensure that Afghan women have a place at the negotiation table? In other words, what can we all do? What can we do to work together and make sure that women, let's say, they do have a voice in important decision-making processes that indeed will determine their future?
I think there are different things that should be done at different levels. For example, the work that you are doing and putting the spotlight on Afghan women is incredibly important because the world cannot forget Afghan women. It is really, I think, by an assessment on many parameters, one of the worst situations in the world for women. In fact, some would say the worst situation in the world for women. And that is not something that we can forget, particularly as we aspire to feminist, injecting feminist foreign policy into our own policy making in terms of trying to improve the situation for women and the world as a whole. We can't simply walk away from Afghan women. So that's in terms of the broader think tank community, policy community would be really critical. In terms of us as policymakers, we need to ensure that every time that we meet with the Taliban, we make absolutely clear that our expectation is that the Taliban meet with the women inside the country, and that they are prepared to meet with women when they want to engage the international community. For example, the Norwegians and the talks that I participated in Oslo made clear to the Taliban that if you want to sit with the international community, you need to sit with Afghan civil society. And they made sure that half of that civil society included very prominent women leaders. That is what every actor who engages with the Taliban, every state actor that engages with the Taliban should put as a demand on the table that Afghan women, they shouldn't be represented by just the policymaking community. They should have a place at the table. And it is incumbent upon us to make space for them to engage directly with the Taliban, whether we're meeting with them outside of the country or whether engagements are taken inside the country. Until the Taliban actually sit down directly across the table from Afghan women, I think we will have really fallen short in advancing their interests and in terms of genuinely putting Afghan women's issues on the table.
Civil society, you mentioned. What room has been left for civil society in Afghanistan?
You know, I think when that shouldn't be underestimated. Afghan women and men are incredibly resilient, and right now, I spend a lot of time engaging with Afghan civil society actors, both those that have been recently exiled, who are engaged with women inside the country, as well as Afghan civil society actors inside the country. And what they know to us is that they will continue to fight. They will continue to be at the forefront of fighting for their rights, for women's rights and human rights. But what they need is our support, both in terms of diplomatically putting their issues on the table, in terms of creating profile around their issues, and also in terms of providing donor support that gets directly to Afghan women. I hear from Afghan women that they are not only hurt by the Taliban, they are also hurt from the fact that the donor community is no longer providing the type of support that is really absolutely essential to enabling women in civil society to survive and ultimately to lead the fight inside the country for their rights.
Yeah. Let me close, because we're running out of time. Let me close with a point on the US role specifically. If you had in a few words, in a few bullet points, if you had to describe the US top priorities with respect to Afghanistan in the nearest future, what would this be?
We are engaging on a number of different fronts, but certainly I think if there's a top line, our engagement is about supporting the rights of Afghan women and men inside the country. The rights-based agenda that Afghan women and men have been fighting for, not just in the last 20 years, but for decades, that we remain very firmly behind supporting their rights, and will continue to engage the Taliban, making very clear, so long as that engagement proves fruitful, that they must respect the rights of Afghan women and men on all fronts. In addition to that, we're looking at certainly the humanitarian issue is of paramount importance. Right now, the U.S. is the largest donor in terms of humanitarian aid. We're also looking to identify how the economy can be better stabilized, how the banking sector could be strengthened, how the private sector can be revived inside the country. And finally, of course, the issue of counterterrorism and security is of critical interest.
Ms. Amiri, our time for today is over. I wish to thank you again for your time, for sharing your knowledge of the Afghanistan dossier with us, and for making us understand what your very important work is really about. We hope that in the future we will have other occasions to meet, hopefully in person. So thank you again, and thank you to our listeners, of course. And
thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Good luck with your work.